Kamisato Ayaka, the child of Hoyoverse, and beloved by so many fans of early Genshin Impact, has been lately perceived as one of the weaker DPSs in the game, and with no buffs on the horizon, this will only make her feel worse and worse heading into the future. This is the history of Ayaka's downfall. For many players, Ayaka once felt like the best DPS in the game. Her insane front-loaded burst and infinite cryo infusion uptime were considered some of the best features a main DPS could have, and Hoyoverse put in a lot of effort into designing this character, and to be honest, I myself started playing Genshin Impact just because I saw Ayaka on someone else's stream. And Hoyoverse's attention to this character cannot be understated. They made her have some of the most overloaded kit at the time, filled her up with damage, and made her birthday coincide with Genshin's official anniversary. Not to mention that she was also in the data files as the first character in the beta when designing the game. Also, in many footages that Hoyo releases about developing Genshin, usually during big live streams, we can see employees playing Ayaka. And of course, Ayaka debuted during one of the biggest patches Genshin ever had, which was the first big expansion into Inazuma, or simply 2.0. However, if we look back to today, it seems that Ayaka has fallen out of flavor and lost all of her attention that she used to receive. Now, let's look at her release and see how she fares with other characters. It's not surprising to see that Ayaka was well at the top of any 2.0 tier list. However, people were still not confident of calling Ayaka the powerhouse or a meta-defining character, and there's many reasons to why that is the case. Many players at the time skipped on Kazuha's banner because they were waiting for 2.0 or simply not playing during his release, and Kazuha is one of the pieces that truly enables Ayaka to shine. His damage amp was crucial at the time to making Ayaka's DPS truly groundbreaking. Second reason people overlooked Ayaka was the lack of elite enemies, and at the time, most of the abysses consisted of rune guards or hilichurls, which are definitely not the elites we are used to right now, and so her burst damage, although on paper it was good, it was kind of useless against waves of hilichurls and was just too overpowered. And besides that, another cryo DPS paired with Venti, I'm talking about Ganyu, could simply do the job better, or I should say on the same level. Now, the third reason is of course the lack of game knowledge, and general player base just did not know what theory crafting was, and basically there was no definitive judgment on how strong Ayaka actually was, with of course no numbers or calculations to back up any claims. But over patches, the abyss where most of the meta is being developed got harder. We saw dogs and Nobushis being added, and this spiked the difficulty and drove up the demand for better DPSs and well-rounded teams, and Ayaka turned out to be the best suited character for the abyss, in particular because she didn't require Bennett, unlike all of the DPS characters that were available at that time. And what is funny is that the factor of not requiring Bennett made Ayaka skyrocket in popularity. The reason why this is the case is that during the majority of the first and second version of the game, there was just a lack of characters in the game in general. There were only about 40 playable characters, and there was a huge gap specifically in buffers, and Dendro not existing, an alternative playstyle if you lack the supports, made the only viable way to play the game being hyper carries. And so virtually every single character wanted to be matched up with Bennett. And after a few patches, with the release of Kokomi and Shenhe, who proved to be best suited with Ayaka, this solidified Ayaka as one of the premier DPSs in the game. And by the end of version 2, Ayaka was at the top of every single tier list in terms of DPS, on par with Hu Tao, who also received the Yelan, but that's a whole different story. Now, with the release of version 3, it didn't start off as a catastrophe for Ayaka. Matter of fact, the first banners brought us our first introduction to Dendro in the form of Tainari, a character who was not particularly best suited with any of the meta DPSs at the time, or in general with the meta defining Hyperbloom teams that will come to be. But something was already clear. Hoyoverse ditched Ayaka and the cryo element as a whole. Cryo was one of the few elements that did not receive a single interaction with Dendro. And now all Ayaka fans were silently waiting for the end to begin. And in patch 3.2 we saw the first glimpse of power creep that was going to eat Ayaka alive. Nahida, the Dendro Archon, had the most overpowered and overloaded kits ever seen by then. Nahida's infinite dendro uptime, insane buffing capabilities alongside with damage did not benefit Kamisato Ayaka the slightest, whereas most other characters received a significant buff or a slight buff in terms of new playstyles or a new buffer in their teams. With Nahida's release, many characters and teams rose to the same power level or surpassed Ayaka. The newly released Nilou, Yaimiko, and all sorts of variations of Hyperbloom teams were estimated to rival Ayaka's potential, and at that time, the community was already filled with prevalent theory crafters who mapped out all of the new Dendro teams and came to the conclusion that they were just stronger not in terms of raw DPS, but also much more consistent and easier to navigate than hypercarry teams. However, it was still not the true end for Ayaka. She was still clearing content and her team archetype was still considered to be strong and close, or rather top tier by many. It was just that investment requirement was significantly higher than aforementioned Dendro compositions. But closing out version 3 with more releases such as Alhaitham, Baiju, and a long-awaited animal buffer in the likes of Farazan, it was evident that Ayaka has seen better days, and all of her fans were hoping for Fontaine to finally introduce a character or a way to buff Ayaka, but that was never destined to happen. Come the first day of Fontaine, and we are immediately introduced to the power creep that will happen throughout the new version. Linny is an odd one, since he is very underestimated by the community and was skipped by the majority of players, but he has been secretly dominating the speedrun scene ever since his release. And many theory crafters at the time were already nominating Linny to be a better DPS than most characters in the game, including Ayaka. And later down the version, literally the next patch, Navia, Nuvolette, and of course, a patch after that, the Hydro Archon Farina were just leagues ahead of what Ayaka teams could do. And matter of fact, Ayaka is just not a great combo with Farina, which made the situation even more dire. And when we saw the release of Shenyun, there was a slimmer of hope that Ayaka might receive an alternative playstyle just because her infusion is basically infinite, but due to the mechanics of how Ayaka's infusion activates, Shenyun also turned out to be nothing more than a sweet dream. And as a result, the final nail in the coffin was Risley, a character that performs extremely well in the Rev Melt, basically overthrowing Ayaka and becoming the new king of the cryo element. Now, besides that, there are just too many things that haven't gone wrong with Ayaka, and this is mostly due to the oversight in her design. Ayaka's burst is very unreliable because of how much knockback it has, and so it is basically almost always required to be played in a freeze setup. However, a lot of the enemies released throughout the last two versions of the game have some sort of freeze resistance built in, where they can't be frozen for long periods of time, which makes Ayaka's burst not deal the entirety of its damage and sometimes deal even less than half of the damage it's intended to do. And when considering that Ayaka's burst is most of her damage, this really lowers Ayaka's overall damage potential. In conjunction with all of the unfreezable bosses being super mobile and occupying half of the abyss rooms, this makes Ayaka feel even worse than ever. And the last thing for Ayaka meta stance is that Coppelia and Coppelios have been present in almost all of the abyss cycles in version 4, with the other half usually being occupied with some sort of element check, which makes Ayaka just not suited for the meta. Now, in retrospective, Ayaka hasn't received a single buff since version 2.4 with the release of Shenhe. Her team has literally stayed the same for more than 2 years now, being Ayaka, Kokumi, Kazuha, Shenhe, and none of these characters have received a better artifact set or a better weapon specifically in this archetype of teams. Besides that, Ayaka was also very popular in Overworld at one point in the game. However, her alternate sprint got also power crept by Farina and other characters who are just easier to use. And on the topic of Overworld, the DPS requirements in Overworld have also been steadily increasing and making Ayaka just not feel as strong as she once was. And with many new enemies being more and more mobile and remaining immune to freeze, Cryo Element as a whole Not just Ayaka can only hope to be revitalized by meld compositions that hopefully await us in that run, but as I said before, Risley is most surely going to be overshadowing Ayaka in that department, and at this point in time, Ayaka will only remain a nostalgic character for 2.0 players, as she will inevitably keep on getting power crept and squashed by the new and powerful units. But again, that is just the true nature of any gacha game. Hopefully you liked the video. If you have something to say, leave a comment, like, and follow. Thanks. This was Zara. Bye.